It's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, B. Lauer. As you'll hear, she was a speaker in the Department of Communication and Journalism, as well as a participant in an innovative conservation science training program that was supported, I guess still supported by the National Science Foundation. But I had the pleasure of being in the room, or the audience, if you will, last summer when she gave a powerful presentation about her innovative work that she did for her master's thesis. And I also happen to know that Bea has a deep love of musical theater. So I thought it made sense to see if she'd be willing to give a version of her talk to this audience, a kind of sustainability reprise, if you will. Now, Bea isn't the first UMaine student to focus on sustainability issues. In fact, at the Mitchell Center, we've had about as many communication students participate in sustainability projects as students pursuing degrees in engineering, economics, wildlife, and so on. Well, exactly what does communication have to do with problem solving? Well, I'm not the person to ask that question, but I'm told that people have been thinking about this for a while, including, of course, Aristotle. So I think you should be listening for how different kinds of communication can help build resilience and collaborative capacity. And one of the, I don't know if it's a strength or a good fortune of Bea, that she was co-advised by Bridie McGreevy and Tony Sutton, who draw upon the strengths of both Western science and Indigenous knowledge, and they're also the embodiment of what it means to build productive collaborations. So please join me in welcoming Bea.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. And listening to you talk about this series, it's truly an honor to be amongst the speakers. I just graduated with my master's, and I have been in this audience for 2 years, the past 2+ years, and it's really an honor to now be on this side of the podium and get to share some of my research with you all. So thank you all for being here in the room, and thank you for those of you who are here on Zoom. Today, I'm going to be talking about unlocking the language of change, understanding social and ecological challenges in Maine's wild shellfish fisheries. And really what I'm going to be talking about today are 2 years of my master's thesis research and work as a research assistant. And while I'm going to be explaining and describing what I found in my research and my process, I also want to talk about how stories, researcher vulnerability, relationships, and communication can be powerful tools in studying social ecological systems. As David really highlighted well, we do need biophysical science, and we need communication, social science, and humanities to work together in order to solve these wicked problems. So I'm going to start at this high level, and I want you to be thinking about these things, and then we'll get down into the nitty-gritty before we come back up to a high level to talk more about how these 4 things really play a role in this research. So a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going to go today. I'm going to do some context building and setting the stage, talk about my research questions, why I chose them, and how they've guided this research, some theoretical groundings, methods, the knowledge that I gathered, and the way I make sense of that knowledge before I bring it all together in a conclusion, or some kind of conclusion, but really asking that question of, so what? What does this research do, and why does it matter? But before I do that, I want to start with this quote by Della Pollock that came to me by way of teaching undergraduate storytelling in my home department, communication and journalism. In it, she speaks to the nature of both stories and change. And I highlight this quote to show the many ways in which these stories inherently change with me as the storyteller and gatherer. I am a non-Indigenous, white, cisgendered woman who has spent most of her life living on Dakota, Wapakouti, Meskwaki, Sioux, Kickapoo, Miamia, Ho-Chunk, and Peoria homelands and waters. I'm a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, a cousin, a niece, a friend, a partner, a teacher, a student, an amateur tap dancer, a level 5 bard for my nerds in the room, amongst many other intersecting identities. And while this research isn't about me, it is filtered through and interpreted by a brain that has spent 27 years being B. Lauer. And with that carries with that set of identities and experiences that makes this work inherently subjective, which I will allude to a little bit more later. But as you all may come to know or already understand, this kind of boundary spanning, transdisciplinary, relational, engaged research demands both vulnerability and presence. And so it's with both of those values in mind that I share with you a collection of stories and observations that I have gathered throughout this research over the past 2 years and change. And perhaps these stories that I share with you have the potential to become, as Della Pollock says, part of the vital histories of change that they recount. So with that, I'm going to start with a story. And that is of my very first day on a mudflat, which is where wild clams are harvested. So I come from the upper Midwest US, which is pretty landlocked, save for some pretty big lakes, but it's not near any oceans or coasts. And so while I've spent most of my life in and around studying and thinking with freshwater, I, in coming to Maine, was very new to oceanic and coastal and marine spaces. And so 2 days after arriving in Orono, Maine, I was invited to my very first mudflat. And I had no idea what to expect, much less what to wear, but I was told to dress in layers and bring the tallest boots that I had. And so after zipping and zooming through windy rural back roads in the backseat of Bridie's car, a fellow graduate student and Bridie and I parked. We got out of the car, we pulled on our boots. I had never seen boots that attach to your belt before so that they don't get stuck in the mud. That was fun. And we walked down to Mudflat in Gouldsboro, Maine for a shellfish community event. And I followed my new colleagues around that day like a lost puppy, asking, is that one a clam? And, oh, I think I've eaten that one before, so it must be a mussel. And wow, look at that crab. Why is it green? I shook many hands. I learned many names. And somewhere along the way, I learned the trick for walking in the mud without getting your boot gobbled up by it. And 2 major things happened for me that day. The first is that my constructed imaginary of what fisheries in Maine looked like, which was primarily constructed of lobstermen on boats coming up to wharves in their yellow hats and jackets and hauling lobster traps off and off to market immediately, which that imaginary is already a little bit flawed. But that day it broke even further to now include this liminal tract of mud where clams and people with baskets and rakes dig them out of the mud are. And it now included that as a part of Maine's fisheries. And in addition to stepping onto the mud for the first time that day, I also stepped into a network of interwoven and ongoing stories that center mud, tides, and shellfish, and that have been going on for time immemorial. And the story that reaches back the furthest, but also includes people, is that of the Wabanaki people whose homelands we find ourselves on today. Wabanaki people have been harvesting shellfish for time immemorial, as evidenced by shellfish middens or mounds, some of which are said to have millions of clamshells within them. We also know this because of place names and the stories of importance told to this day about attuning to cycles of mud and tides. Another story into which I stepped is that of a colonially constructed fishery in which hundreds of commercial harvesters harvest enough clams to make soft-shelled clams, the second most economically valuable fishery in the state. Recreational and commercial harvesting of wild shellfish has become a hallmark of this place and its cultures for both Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki people. I also stepped into a story of collaborative governance of a social ecological system. Wild shellfish are managed through what is known as a co-management system. So it's a partnership between the State Department of Marine Resources and 70 plus municipalities, all of which are listed there, who hold shellfish ordinances at either the municipal or regional scale. And this system of shared responsibility and power is one of the unique hallmarks of wild shellfish fisheries, as no other fisheries in the state are managed quite in this same way. And this social ecological system faces issues of water quality, ocean warming, acidification, gentrification, displacement, and dispossession. And these issues are being met with creativity, collaboration, and care. And the co-management system, this partnership, is really key to understanding how these issues are addressed. I also stepped into an ongoing story of networks and relationships that were formed by my advisors and colleagues for collectively over a decade. Many of these relationships and networks came together in the formation of the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, or MSLN, which emerged to address a set of identified needs to support the co-management system and fisheries. The MSLN works to build relationships, improve communications within that co-management system, to promote equity and build adaptive capacity. The Maine Shellfish Learning Network works to identify issues within the fisheries, understand the context surrounding them, identify a team to work towards a solution, and co-create that solution. And the MSLN really gave me the support and the opportunities that I needed in order to show up, listen, and start learning in many different spaces. And so recognizing these overlapping and ongoing stories that proved important for understanding how I and this work fit into this bigger picture. In fact, it was building on these networks and relationships that I found myself in listening and learning mode my very first summer in Maine. So we're now going to take a step back out of this interwoven story and back into my story that first summer in Maine in listening and learning mode. So during that first summer, spending time on mud flats and in boats and in conversations and in meetings and otherwise being my colleagues' annoying shadow, learning and listening, I kept hearing this word access over and over again. It came up in all of these spaces, but it didn't seem to hold the same meaning. And it changed depending on who was speaking, where they were from, what corner of the coast they called home. But no matter who was using it or how it was being used, three things were incredibly clear. The first was that access was seemingly being lost, and that was being felt across the coast. The second is that access is really crucial to the functioning of wild intertidal shellfish fisheries. And third was that people within the greater wild intertidal shellfish community were actively working to protect, preserve, and expand access. And I should note that I leave the term access now somewhat ambiguous to reflect that ambiguity that I was feeling at that point in time in my listening and learning. And so access, this wicked problem, became the focus of my graduate research. And that leads me to my research questions. So first, I really wanted to hone into that question of what do people mean when they use the word access? What does that mean? How does that manifest in different spaces? Really understanding a shared definition there. And I also wanted to understand this broader discourse of how people were talking about access. And I'll define the word discourse in a minute, but really looking at all of the different communicative interactions and how access was popping up in those. What were the major topics that came up as people were talking about access? And then how did those major topics that I was hearing and listening to apply and connect to people's lived experience with losses of access? And so these really became my questions as I moved through my research and work. And so at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about my theories and methods and provide some definitions for the theories that I was working with, but really talk about what I did to answer those questions. So as promised, some definitions that might be helpful. As I was new to ocean spaces and coastal spaces, I was also incredibly new to communication as a field, and to this term rhetoric, which comes up in my space in communication a lot. My undergraduate degree is in biology, and so this was all very new to me. And I still don't know if I have the definition of rhetoric down perfectly. However, when I found this quote from Meyerson and Ryden in 1996, lots of things really clicked for me. They define rhetoric as noticing the words and the worlds inherent in them. And what I love most about this definition of rhetoric is that it positions rhetoric as active. It is both doing the work of shaping and being shaped by lived reality. And that's really important, especially for this research, which is rhetorical research, but it really uses this definition of rhetoric. Another definition, as promised, is that of discourse. So while rhetoric is noticing, discourse can be defined as the sum of communicative interactions. So discourse is a body or a set of those communicative interactions, a body of rhetorical structures, beings, objects, and realities. So thinking about the ways in which we're seeing communication manifest, where we're seeing it manifest, discourse is a contained body at which we can look at something specific. So these are two of the big definitions that really drove the theory, and there are some more specific theoretical orientations that I used. But for the purpose of this talk, I really wanted to focus on how I did this. So what were the ethical commitments and also the methodological practices that I used? And the first of those is that I used a transdisciplinary and engaged approach. So as David mentioned in his introduction, and as I've alluded to, wicked environmental problems really require a transdisciplinary approach, especially when it is a social and ecological system like a fishery that is both inherently ecological and environmental, and is also part of people's livelihoods and culture and their very existence. And so while my home department is communication and journalism, I was also part of the NRT for conservation science and practice. And I bring with that both a biophysical side and a biophysical mind, and this newly found social science side, as well as borrowing concepts from many different disciplines, including political science and anthropology. And so really this project doesn't only belong to one singular discipline. And furthermore, this research was engaged, which means that it wasn't just me as a researcher or our research team that were driving the questions that we were asking. We really wanted to provide capacity and research to the broader community surrounding wild intertidal shellfish to be able to answer questions that were emerging out of their dialogue and out of their conversations. So that's what engaged really means to me. Furthermore, I used an anti-colonial praxis, which to me means, and as I'm learning from many authors and scholars who write about this, including Kimmerer, McGreevy and Renko, Tallbear, Sutton, and Smith, an anti-colonial praxis really works to disrupt the colonial forces that are inherent in many research styles. And many people ask, well, what does that mean? And what does that look like for you as you are conducting research? And to me, pulling from an existing body of literature and learning from this literature, to me, that means centering relationships within this work. So really taking that relationship first approach, meeting people in the community, not as a researcher, but as a person to listen and learn. Also slowing down the pace of research to allow time for iterative conversations and reflexivity. So really not trying to push forward my research agenda, but again, being able to come back to people that I was working with as people and talk about what this means and where we want to see these questions going. Also honoring diverse forms of knowledge. So not just thinking about biophysical and scientific forms of knowledge, or the forms of knowledge that come out of academia in communication or in other humanities, but honoring experiential knowledge and traditional knowledge too, as very integral and as integral parts of a broader body of ways of knowing. And also practicing reciprocity, both with the people that I worked with and learned with, but also with the land. Furthermore, I used rhetorical field methods. So this is again where the rhetoric comes back. And as you can read in this quote from Rye and Druschke, rhetorical field methods really look at what phrases, ideas, forces, practices, and desires have purchased on their field sites, questioning how language, symbols, and other forms of communication interact with, create, and emerge from both local ecologies and global discourses / policies. So rhetorical field methods really gave me a lens through which and a means through which to connect the discourse and the communication that I was hearing and experiencing and reading, and connect it and ground it in the physical space, which for the purpose of this research and these fisheries is really crucial. You can't just talk about the fisheries and access without tying those to the physical space where people are trying to access and where access is actively being lost. And so with that, springing from both those definitions of discourse and rhetoric and those ethical commitments and practices, I threw myself into this discourse surrounding access in as many places as I could find. So I attended meetings, I had conversations, I held informal interviews, I read statutes and ordinances, news media, I analyzed governance systems and legal opinions, looked at existing communication materials and attended conferences, all while eating baskets of fried clams and enjoying them and being in coastal spaces and on mudflats as much as possible. And with that, I want to talk about the knowledge that I was able to gather and also my analysis of that knowledge. And so first, we have to talk about the meanings of access that I found as I was listening to people, as I was attuning to these communications. And first, there are three different primary forms of access that I heard. And while these don't necessarily encompass every single time and every single meaning, most, I should say, of the forms of access that I heard come up in conversation really fell into one of these three broad areas. And the first is physical access. So the ability to be physically present in and travel to the intertidal area where clams and other shellfish are harvested. Second, structural forms of access. So the ways in which policies and governance structures allow for access, and also the accessibility of those decision-making spaces. And third, but certainly not least, are social forms of access. So the social norms that influence the ability to access the coast and fisheries, and community support and awareness. And I'll provide more examples of these and how they come up in the discourse as we move along. So we can already start to see that access is really complex and that this issue is really complex. It's not just about physical access. There are other forms as well. But I wanted to go one step further to understand this broader discourse surrounding access. And to do that, I took a topical approach. So we can think about topics as sites of importance or recurring themes around which other ideas are organized. So to explain further, we can look at this topographical map. So if this map is broadly a discourse, right, that sum of communicative interactions, the peaks here are the topics that uniquely characterize this landscape from others. So from this, using this, I looked at what those main topics within the discourse of access are and how those uniquely characterize the discourse surrounding access. And we'll revisit this analogy later as well. So to start talking about what topics emerged, or another word for topics is topoi, I found these four primary topics that emerged within this discourse and uniquely characterized it to me. And those were inequities and equities within governance structures, crisis and tragedy narratives, changing environments, identities, and cultures, and resilience. And I'll work through those and unpack them a little bit here. So first, I want to talk about inequities within governance structures. So this topic is characterized by components of ambiguity, lopsided power allocations, knowledge hierarchies, and exclusion and property rights. And first, I'll start with a brief story. So in the spring of 2022, state managers of wild shellfish fisheries hosted a series of listening sessions, formally referred to as regional co-management workshops. And they invited municipal managers with whom they co-manage the fisheries, as well as harvesters, researchers, scientists, municipal fish officials, etc. They brought them together to discuss what a successful municipal shellfish program looks like. And these 4 workshops, 3 held at different places across the coast and 1 held on Zoom, produced a large number of both identified issues and solutions to those issues. Access was primary among those issues. However, both state officials and municipal officials seemed to leave these meetings a little bit unclear on whose responsibility it was to enact the solutions, especially those pertaining to access. And this kind of unclear delineation of responsibility, and perhaps more importantly, power, make it unclear who should be and who can be acting to do what to protect, preserve, and expand access. Secondly, within the co-management system and the fisheries more broadly, there's a clear delineation and prioritization of forms of knowledge. Quantitative, biophysical, scientific data is usually valued above all else, often to the exclusion of experiential knowledge and expertise of harvesters and local shellfish managers. These forms of knowledge do not always agree on things like soft-shell clam populations, soft-shell clam population levels, aka how many clams are in the mud in any given spot, which is a really important thing to know. And this inequity leads to further dysfunction in governance and a striation of power and value within the governance spaces. Thirdly, the force of colonialism is active in many ways. Not only are tribal members not ensured protection and support to harvest wild shellfish across the coast, but colonial ideas of privatization of property and exclusion from physical spaces persist for Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki people. For example, in order to obtain a residential commercial clam harvesting license, which is necessary to buy and sell, or to harvest and sell clams, one must meet residency requirements outlined in municipal ordinance. And these residency requirements vary widely across the coast, with some only requiring 3 months of residence within municipal borders, while others require over a year. Recently, the increasing cost of housing along the coast, and everywhere in Maine, especially has restricted many from meeting these residency requirements, therefore restricting them from obtaining licenses and accessing clam harvesting as a livelihood. These residency requirements are a clear embodiment of colonial practices of privatization of property and exclusion from space that can be traced back as far as the Doctrine of Discovery, written in 1493. Next, I want to talk about crisis and tragedy narratives and what they do in this space and in this discourse. So this topic is characterized by a simplistic and unidimensional view of access that results in inequitable and hasty solution building. News media very regularly depicts wild shellfish fisheries as in decline, dying, or dead. And you can see that here in a news media analysis made into this infographic from one of my colleagues at the Maine Shellfish Learning Network. She worked to harvest headlines from different news media outlets across the state that pertain to soft-shell clams and characterize the words within them as generally positive, generally negative, or neutral. And as you can see, there's a lot of red, and perhaps there's a lot more red. And the size of the words corresponds to the number of times that that word or phrase came up within headlines. So it's often characterized as in decline, dying, or dead. And in addition, some biophysical scientists in the field also perpetuate this crisis narrative. Harvesters are seeing losses of walk-in access, and shellfish populations are changing. And harvesters are being threatened by landowners who do not understand harvesters' legal protections to fish in intertidal spaces, regardless of property lines. In many ways, this is being felt as a crisis. However, this crisis narrative often gets spun into one of tragedy and blame. And the very harvesters who are experiencing losses of access are also being blamed for their contributions to an exacerbation of those losses of access. And through the perpetuation of harmful stigmas associated with working in the mud and clam harvesting being characterized as a fishery of last resort, these crisis narratives that lead to blame are being perpetuated. These narratives may be perpetuated in the media and in a broader discourse, but however, they neglect acts of care and stewardship that are being enacted on the mud. Communities, often led by harvesters, are leading efforts to repopulate flats, build relationships with landowners, and regain access points. And the crisis narrative and accompanying blame only serves to erase those acts of care and stewardship. And it also instills a sense of urgency, which often leads to quick creation of solutions that often reinforces structural inequities. Next, I want to talk about changing environments, cultures, and identities. I was in a meeting about shellfish, as I usually am, and someone stood up and they said what I perceive to be the quiet part out loud. And they said, quote, "Mainers don't like change." And what this person was saying was felt by many. People in Maine, especially non-Wabanaki coastal landowners and coastal users, have been experiencing a perceived new onslaught of changes in recent years, changing ecosystems, rising home prices, people from away moving into coastal communities, aging commercial fishing populations. And this is marked by a fear of change that accompanies a threat to life and being that many have known for their whole lives. This can often be accompanied in the discourse by solutions for preserving and protecting this way of life. However, in many instances, that way of life that is clinged to is one that is built upon the exclusion of others and the reinforcement of inequities. For example, commercial clamming in Maine today is primarily practiced by older white men. As these harvesters see an aging fleet and clamming attracting fewer youth from coastal communities, conversations have turned to bringing in immigrant and BIPOC youth to carry forth the tradition of clamming. And while the industry does need diversification, there's very little conversation about the harm that accompanies bringing in people into a system that was not built for them and in many ways was built to exclude them intentionally. This kind of colonialism and white supremacy should not be reinforced as a tool to prolong the life of identities and cultures. And talking about change and building upon this idea of change, I want to talk about a response to change, which is often to build resilience. Normative ideas of resilience, as they come out of biophysical sciences and ecology, embody this idea of bouncing back to an original state after a disturbance or a change. So we can see that in this infographic that I pulled from the NOAA website, where there's a community, a system, there's some kind of disaster, it strikes, there's a response, and then there is a return to that original state of the community or the system. This kind of resilience is often mentioned within this discourse. How can we make these systems, ecosystems, and structures elastic so that they can bounce back to a static state after a disturbance? However, what this model does not account for is what needs to break. What parts of a system should not be resilient, and who gets to decide that? Additionally, what voices need to be considered for this to happen, for a more transformational form of resilience to shine through. Resilience in the ways that humans respond to change is subjective and highly dependent on who gets to dictate how a system responds to change. And there are those within this community who are working towards a more transformative form of resilience. Those who are not only trying to protect and preserve, but also and regain new forms of access, but find new meanings of access and what new access needs to look like in this time and in these specific spaces. And I think that this form of transformative resilience will prove really necessary in responding to the growing changes that Maine is facing. So I promised that we would revisit this topo map, and I want to bring it back around to talk about what these topics mean together. So we remember that these topics that I just covered are all central topics or recurring themes around which other ideas and arguments are organized. So we can begin to map these topics onto this map of a discourse, giving us a better idea of what makes this discourse about access unique and what it looks like overall. Furthermore, I'm going to stick with this analogy. And if these topics are the peaks, they are connected by ideas and forces that run like threads through all them. These peaks of the topics are connected by foothills of responsibility, urgency, a sense of place, inequity, responses to change, colonialism, care, and frustration. And so this brings me to what I feel should be the question that all researchers ask themselves: so what? So what does this all mean, and how can this be used by those who are working to protect, preserve, and expand access? One of the things that I noticed when I first started attuning to access-oriented conversations was that people were proposing solutions without even having a shared definition of what the word access meant, much less by understanding the diversity of threats to access, what those were and what those are. This kind of analysis of the discourse offers almost a microcosm with which we can examine the broader issue as it is felt and experienced in reality, because as rhetoric teaches us, communication both shapes and is shaped by reality. And so in studying the rhetoric and the discourse, we can better understand that lived reality. This research also provides a base from which to create more informed and complex solutions that match the complexity of the issues at hand. And that is not only communicated through this presentation and my written thesis, but it's also being communicated to the broader community through a technical report and through the ongoing work of the Maine Shellfish Learning Network and the many partners that we worked with throughout this work. Furthermore, this research poses a set of critical questions like, what do we mean by access? Access to what and for whom? What needs to break in order for this fishery to become more sustainable and transformatively resilient? And in what ways can we disrupt colonial thinking that is ingrained in the very systems, structures, and actors of this fishery? And I pose these questions so that the wild intertidal shellfish fisheries in Maine can grow to be more connected, more sustainable, and more equitable. And this work was done in really close and constant partnership with the community in and surrounding wild intertidal shellfish fisheries in Maine. And every step of the way throughout this process of really deep, engaged listening and engaging and then doing. And in this way, I'm far from the sole holder of this information and this knowledge co-creation and this momentum. Instead, the push comes from within this community for this community and really continues to roll along within this community and within these spaces. And this work has sparked many and supported many conversations and, more importantly, actions. And in this way, even though I may be stepping back from this work and from these spaces and from these fisheries, the questions and ideas that I have worked to co-create with countless collaborators continues on even as I step out of this. I also want to talk about what we can learn from this kind of research. So revisiting that idea of what stories, researcher vulnerability, communication can really do. And my main takeaways from this are that social science and humanities can and do play an active role in social ecological systems research. And the National Science Foundation Research Traineeship for Conservation Science and Practice, a mouthful, is a great embodiment of that there are graduate students from social sciences like communication, as well as many other biophysical sciences within those classrooms and within that community of learning. But really what I can point to with this research is that while the biophysical science is very important, and we do need to be able to quantify the phenomena that we're seeing on the land and in the water, it's also really important to understand the social phenomena that are happening in concert with those biophysical phenomena. Sorry for using the word phenomena so much, but that especially when we're looking at a complex social ecological system like a fishery, where those two sides are inherently tied together, we really need a transdisciplinary team that includes biophysical and social scientists. Furthermore, stories can be evidence of observed phenomena. Like I said, I come from biophysical science, where when I was collecting data, that was in the form of numbers, and those numbers could be arranged into tables, and those tables could be analyzed by running regressions and different statistical methods. And so when I came to communication and when I came to rhetoric, I felt like an imposter in a lot of ways, and I didn't feel like what I was doing was collecting data, until I had a little bit of an aha moment where I realized that the stories, which are my lived experiences and the lived experiences of others, that is data. That is evidence for the things that people are observing, and that is real. And so with that, also, graduate students in the room, if you have imposter syndrome, it's normal. But also that it's not easy to conduct slow and relational research as a student, but it is possible. One of the very first things that I worried about coming into this program and knowing that this was the kind of research I would be engaging in was, will there be enough time to create these relationships and to do meaningful, engaged research? And luckily, I was stepping into a research team and was mentored and guided by amazing advisors who brought me into their existing networks and relationships. And that would really be my advice to other graduate students who are looking to do this kind of work, is find the right mentor team and find the people who can shepherd you through this process, because that really takes it from impossible to possible. It's not easy, but it is possible. And with that, I have many thank yous. Thank you so much to Ruth Halsworth and Carol Hamill, David Hart and Linda Silka. Thank you to my advisors and committee and the rest of the MSLN team, to Wild Intertidal Shellfish Fishery Community in Maine, my partners and collaborators and co-conspirators. Thank you to project funders, both the NSF and a fund of the Maine Community Foundation. And thank you to the mudflats, the waters, rivers, and clams. And if you are interested in learning more about this research and the work of the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, you can visit this QR code or themudflat.org, where we have a lot of information about wild intertidal shellfish fisheries broadly, great work that is ongoing within the community, and some of our work as researchers within that space. So thank you all so much for being here, and I'm happy to take questions.
That was so incredibly wonderful. I mean, it was just so helpful to all of this. You fairly early on started with the question, so what? Well, boy, you answered that. You really answered that. And another thing that kept sort of, I'm sure, going through people's minds is, well, how do new students get involved? What would you tell them? You gave us information about that. That was very helpful. And being a fellow Midwesterner, I absolutely loved when you talked about your very first day in the clam flat you know, and what it was like, and the boots, and how just how foreign it all was, and how wonderful at the same time. So there was such a nice continuity in your presentation that it really helped us. You helped bring us along so that we can now think of, what can we do? How can we use this information? How would it be helpful? And one of the things that was really very, very interesting among all of the interesting things is you really helped us see how transdisciplinary and engaged research is central to this work, that it's very important to honor diverse forms of knowledge. Not easy. We all have to learn. It's very important. You talked about show up, listen, learn. So you use different terms to help us think about how we weave together a lot of information that might look like it can't be woven together. There's a great project going on now in Maine that is looking at how you bring Indigenous knowledge and Western science together in the classroom in grade schools throughout the state, so that things really, people see all the ways that things really come together, and it's just so important. You also told us a lot that was really helpful about that project doesn't belong to a single discipline. Might you have an example that shows, this is maybe unfair to ask you, but a problem that came up around that and how you solved it?
Ooh, problem that came up around that and how I solved it. If I had time to sit and think with it, I'm sure that I could come up with a specific problem and within that and how we work to solve it. But I think instead I'm going to give you an example of how we married together, or how more broadly the MSLN marries together some of these different forms of knowing. And one of my favorite examples of that is actually not my work at all, but of my colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Hillier, who gave a fantastic dissertation defense earlier in this year as well. But she really comes from marine sciences, and she has done this amazing work looking at I can't even say it properly, but looking at the ways in which water moves in different areas along the coast, creating these oceanographic models that really help communities make decisions about where to reseed clam flats, or how to make these management decisions understanding oceanographic models. And so it's not my work, but she and the work that she does with the MSLN is really a great example of that, where she takes that oceanographic model and that biophysical data, but then also is understanding the ways in which communication is at work, and the ways in which political science is almost also happening within these local decision-making spaces, and marrying those all together in a really engaged and applied way. So while I might not have a great example of my own work, I am informed by a lot of the ways in which she does those things. She's really an expert at that. So I hope that provides.
That's really wonderful. You also had just a great way in talking about your research of taking something that people often say or is often heard, and you do interesting transformational things about it. So, for example, you used the instance where people say Mainers don't like change. And rather than just leaving it at that, you did this really interesting analysis of how do we respond to change? What parts of a system, norms and policies say should not be resilient, where the change may be needed. So that one of the interesting things you helped us learn is don't give up on certain things. Just really think about, okay, yeah, let's recognize what's going on. Let's think about it. But how can we all come together and do something interesting about that? Do you have thoughts about that, or things you want to comment on in terms of that?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I always say I came to grad school was to learn how to ask better questions and to learn how to ask more and better and more meaningful questions. And now, I guess a blessing and a curse of being a communication scholar and a rhetorician is that I can't hear anything without asking questions about the language that's used. And so that phrase, or that phrase of Mainers don't like change, there's so much to unpack there. Who are Mainers? What does Mainers mean? What kind of change don't we like? Why don't we like it? And so I find that that's this amazing tool that I now have coming out of graduate school. And I think I would also encourage other folks in different disciplines too, to really hone in on what is the language that's being used and what's really behind that, to be able to keep asking those questions.
Boy, that's just so wonderful and so amazing. David, did you have some people in the room that just want to say things and I've been talking too much?
Yeah, please.
So have you, through your research, possibly established or been thinking about establishing different policies to preserve access?
Yeah, that's a great question. So without going too far into the weeds, one of the things that I was actually working on this past summer was a tax incentive to help coastal landowners, to incentivize coastal landowners to allow access across their privately held land. And so I was working with a group of people who came together. We're called the Coastal Access Strategy Exchange. This group formed really organically after a panel presentation that I helped facilitate. Anyways, this group came together and we said, what kinds of policies can we help either change or help create in order to incentivize access? And so this policy, which actually was just recently sent to the state legislature for review, is looking at how can we amend an existing tax law and tax program to make space for intertidal and walk-in users. So right now it's built for working waterfront, which is often thought about even in policy spaces as boats and wharves and piers, but often doesn't include people walking on a path to the coast. And so we're trying to make that policy and that program more inclusive to provide incentives to create more access for walk-in folks. So I hope that helps. And there are a lot of other policies too that are being bounced around within groups of folks who are working on this, but that's the most concrete one for right now. Thank you.
Yeah, I really loved this concept of what needs to break. I think that's terrific. The other thing that really interested me was this one of your pillars or one of your hills there had to do with this rhetoric of tragedy and victimhood and crisis. You know, and that word is really deeply ingrained in us in this business, right? The tragedy of the commons.
Oh yeah.
It's right there.
Yeah.
What rhetoric have you observed that kind of goes against that and sort of builds a different narrative?
Yeah. So one of the biggest areas of rhetoric and action is actually care, and looking at how care and crisis can be juxtaposed. And there's actually going to be an article in the Maine Policy Review, hopefully, we'll see, where some colleagues and advisors have written about just that, and thinking about, and that really comes out of environmental communication too, looking at how narratives and crisis frames can be challenged with frames of care and narratives of care. And so in this example, it's really clear that those acts of care and the embodiment of care is happening, but it's not being talked about in the same way as the crisis narrative. And in many ways, that crisis narrative works to flatten the experiences and narratives of care. And so, Bridie, you could probably say the authors' names, but the piece that's about crisis to care.
Yeah, so this is a really active conversation in environmental communication, and Phaedra Pizzulo and Robert Cox are key leaders. talking about this relationship between crisis and care. But the critiques of crisis are also somewhat longstanding, and Kyle White, who's a Potawatomi scholar, has done multiple critiques of the crisis epistemologies and is offering more relational practices of care as an alternative. I'm happy to share with you.
You're interested,
Yeah.
Just to reiterate for Zoom, Robert Cox, Phaedra Pizzullo, and Kyle White are some of the scholars within environmental communications who are really addressing this crisis and care narrative. Thank you.
And just to put in, you mentioned Maine Policy Review, and the special issue that's going to be coming out is going to have the title Our Shared Ocean.
And we have time for one more question here.
Just to build on that, can you say a little bit more about the concept of care?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit difficult, especially as a burgeoning rhetorician who has been at conferences where, folks who are really well-established rhetoricians have been focusing in on a singular word and expanding that out to the many ways in which it can be described and also experienced. And so I'm not capable of doing that, but the ways in which I see it emerging within this discourse and emerging within this space is really tied to this idea of stewardship. And that when we look at the acts of care that are happening on the mud that might be erased by the crisis narrative, that looks like harvesters who are taking time out of their day, out of their low tide where they could be harvesting clams and earning money to go trap green crabs, because they know that green crabs are an invasive species who harm shellfish populations for everybody. And so it's that act of stewardship for the broader good that, yes, it benefits them too, but it really benefits the land, it benefits the shellfish, and it benefits the broader community. That embodiment of almost neighborliness and stewardship is really how I see care characterized in this space. And there are many other examples that I could give, but that really rises to the top. Thank you for the question.
So we're at time, so I probably ought to draw things to a close. I've got a long list of things to talk with you about later, but and if anybody else does, come on up or send an email. Linda, thanks again for your great job, and B, thanks a ton. Wonderful.